The scream came again, louder this time. It jolted me out of my thoughts as I lay on my mattress, staring at the dark ceiling of my tiny room in the compound. I grabbed my phone, flicked on the flashlight, and tiptoed to my door. My heart thumped so loudly I feared it might drown out the noise outside. "Help! Somebody help!" a woman's voice cried. It was coming from the central courtyard of our compound. Who they shout for this kind midnight? I muttered under my breath, sliding the door open just enough to peep. Other tenants were emerging too. Clutching wrappers around themselves, sleepy eyes wide with curiosity and fear. At the center of the courtyard stood Mommy Precious, the woman whose loud voice was now shaking the compound awake. She was pointing at someone, trembling like a leaf caught in the harmattan breeze. The moonlight made it clear who she was accusing, Oga Landlord. And in his hands, barely visible in the dim light, was a white cloth streaked with fresh blood. The events of that night were the beginning of the end. But to understand how we got there, let me take you back a little. When I first moved to Peter's compound in Onitsha, I thought I had struck gold. The rent was affordable, especially for such a massive building with decent amenities. The compound had 35 flats and a lively mix of tenants, young families, single workers like me, retirees, and students. The place was never quiet, but it was always welcoming. At the center of it all was Mr. Peter, or Oga Landlord, as everyone called him. A towering man with an imposing presence, he was dark-skinned, bald, and always clad in immaculate white. Even his shoes were white. For someone in his 70s, he had an energy that belied his age. He would walk around the compound every morning, greeting tenants and chatting with children. He was generous to a fault, giving money, toys, and food to anyone who asked, or even those who didn't. People adored him. Oga Landlord is a godsend, I often heard women say. Where else can you find a rich man that treats everyone equally? He didn't act like a billionaire. He lived among us, ate the same food we ate, and seemed genuinely invested in everyone's well-being. But as time went on, I started to notice the cracks in his perfect image. It began with small things. Cynthia, Mommy Amanda's daughter, came home one day with a shiny new doll. "Uncle Peter bought it for me," she announced proudly. Mommy Amanda I didn't seem pleased. She grabbed the doll, examined it, then muttered something about how Mr. Peter was too nice to the children. Later that evening, I overheard Mommy Amanda scolding Cynthia in their flat. "What did he do? Tell me," she demanded. I couldn't hear the child's response, but I heard sobbing. The next day, Mama Ame was her usual cheerful self, acting as if nothing had happened. When I asked her about it, she shrugged. "Nothing dey happen, my brother. Children dey lie sometimes," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. One evening, I was sitting on the steps outside my flat, scrolling through my phone, when Mr. Peter walked past with two young girls trailing behind him. Both couldn't have been older than 10. They giggled as he led them to his flat. I didn't think much of it at first. Everyone knew he loved children, and they loved him back. But when an hour passed, then two, and the girls hadn't come out, I felt a strange unease. My neighbor, Samson, who was sitting nearby, must have noticed my expression. "What is it?" he asked. "Those girls," I said, nodding toward Mr. Peter's door. "Don't you think it's strange?" Samson laughed. "Strange how? Oga Landlord they play with children. You know Amene." "Yes, but," I hesitated. "Why does he never bring women to his flat? Or even men? It's always children." Samson shrugged. "Maybe he just likes kids. Stop overthinking." But I couldn't shake the feeling. The turning point came a few weeks later. Mommy Precious, one of the most outspoken women in the compound, barged into my flat one evening. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she grabbed my arm. "Samson," she whispered urgently, "I need you to come." "Come where? What happened?" I asked, confused. She shook her head. "Just come. You go see." Reluctantly, I followed her to her flat. Inside, her daughter, Ada, sat on the couch, clutching a bag of sweets and a shiny red toy car. Her face was tear-streaked, and she looked terrified. "What happened?" I asked. Mommy Precious pointed to the bag. "Where do you think she got this from?" I frowned. "Oga landlord." She nodded. I asked her what happened. She said Uncle Peter told her not to tell anyone. But look, she pulled Ada's arm, revealing faint bruises near her wrist. "She won't say what he did, but I know something is wrong." I felt my stomach churn. This wasn't the first time I had heard whispers about Oga landlord and the children. But this was the first time someone was showing me proof. "We need to do something," I said. Mommy Precious nodded, her eyes blazing with determination. "We will." What followed was a series of discoveries that turned my unease into outright horror. Precious and I began keeping a closer watch on Mr. Peter. We noticed how often children went into his flat and how long they stayed. We heard whispers from other parents, stories of bruises, missing toys, and children who suddenly grew quiet and withdrawn. But it wasn't until Precious saw him late one night, emerging from his private room with a blood-stained white cloth, that we realized just how deep the darkness went. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the locked room in his flat, the one no one was allowed to enter. What was he hiding? And why did everyone in the compound seem so eager to ignore the signs? The blood-stained cloth was just the beginning. What we discovered next would shake the entire community to its core. The compound was buzzing the next morning. Everyone was talking about the commotion from the night before, Mommy Precious' scream, Oga landlord's bloodied cloth, and the strange silence that followed. But as the sun rose higher, the chatter shifted. People began to laugh it off, dismissing it as a misunderstanding. Oga landlord himself walked around the compound as if nothing had happened, handing out crisp naira notes to anyone who greeted him. "You see," Obi said, grinning as he waved a 500 naira note in my face. "All that shouting for nothing. Oga landlord no get wala." I didn't respond. I couldn't shake the memory of the bloodied cloth. And I couldn't ignore the look on Mommy Precious's face when she stormed into my room that night, raw fear and anger mixed together. Later that day, Mommy Precious came to me again. This time, she wasn't trembling. She was furious. "Samson, we can't keep quiet anymore," she said, slamming her hand on the plastic table in my room. "That man is doing something evil, and we need to stop him." "But how?" I asked, lowering my voice. "Do you know how powerful he is? People worship him in this community. Who will believe us?" She sat down, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I saw what I saw. And I know what I know. We need proof." "Proof?" I asked, frowning. "What kind of proof?" "The room," she said. "The one he locks all the time. Whatever he's hiding, it's in there." The idea of sneaking into Oga landlord's flat sent chills down my spine. The man was loved by everyone in the compound. If he caught us, or worse, if his loyal followers found out, we would be finished. But I couldn't deny the feeling in my gut that Mommy Precious was right. That night, we waited until the compound was quiet. Around 11 p.m., Oga landlord left in his white SUV, a common occurrence for him. He often claimed to be attending business meetings in town. This was our chance. Precious and I crept out of our flats and made our way to his. She carried a flashlight, and I carried a screwdriver I had borrowed earlier in the day. My heart pounded as we reached his door. "Are you sure about this?" I whispered. "Do you want to find out the truth or not?" she shot back. I nodded, swallowing hard. The main door was surprisingly easy to unlock. Inside, the sitting room looked just as I remembered from the few times I had been invited in, a large, luxurious space with leather sofas, a giant flat-screen TV, and walls covered with awards and certificates. But there was no time to admire the decor. We headed straight for the hallway where his private room was located. The door to the room was heavy and made of metal, unlike the wooden doors for the other rooms. A large padlock hung from the latch. I pulled out the screwdriver and began working on it, my hands trembling. "Hurry up," Precious whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. After what felt like an eternity, the padlock finally clicked open. I pushed the door open, and the first thing that hit me was the smell, a metallic, sickly odor that made my stomach turn. Precious shone her flashlight inside, and we both froze. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, with no windows. At the center was a large iron pot, the kind used for traditional cooking. The pot was covered with a lid, but dark stains had seeped out from under it and dried on the floor. Surrounding the pot were piles of white handkerchiefs, all stained with varying shades of red. On the walls were shelves lined with small jars, each labeled with a child's name. Inside the jars were strange objects, bits of hair, nails, and what looked like teeth. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to throw up. "What is this?" Precious whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could respond, her flashlight landed on a notebook sitting on a small table. She picked it up and began flipping through the pages. Her eyes widened as she read. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She handed me the notebook, her hands shaking. I scanned the pages, my horror growing with every word. The notebook detailed years of rituals, sacrifices, and blood offerings. Each entry described a child, their name, age, and the offerings they provided. The blood, it seemed, was the most important part. We heard a noise outside and froze. Someone was coming. "Close it. Close it," Precious hissed. I quickly shut the notebook and placed it back on the table. We locked the door and hurried out of the flat, leaving everything as we had found it. My heart pounded as we made our way back to our flats, praying we wouldn't get caught. The next morning, I couldn't look at Ogre Landlord the same way. He walked around the compound as usual, smiling and chatting with tenants, handing out money and gifts. But now, I saw the monster behind the mask. Precious and I agreed to keep quiet for now. We needed more evidence, something undeniable. But every time I saw him with a child, my anger and fear grew. How could someone so loved, so trusted, be capable of such evil? A few days later, something happened that changed everything. Mommy Sandra, a mother of 3, caught Ogre Landlord leading her youngest daughter, Victoria, into his flat. She screamed and confronted him, attracting the attention of the entire compound. Ogre Landlord tried to calm her down, but Mommy Sandra wasn't having it. "She is just a child," she shouted. "What are you doing with her?" The crowd that gathered was divided. Some defended him, insisting he was just being kind. Others began whispering, recalling their own suspicions. That night, Precious and I decided it was time to act. The compound felt different that night. It wasn't the usual buzz of laughter or arguments between tenants over water bills or noisy children. Instead, there was an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional bark of a stray dog or the hum of a generator. In the shadows of my flat, Precious and I sat huddled, planning our next move. The incident with Mommy Sandra and her daughter, Victoria, had brought tension to the surface. Rumors spread quickly, but without solid proof, they were just whispers. We needed something that would make people see the truth, a truth we were now certain of but couldn't yet prove. The following day, the compound was buzzing again, but this time the whispers were louder. Mommy Sandra, who had always dismissed her daughter's bruises as childish clumsiness, now seemed restless. She avoided Ogre Landlord, her usual cheerful greetings replaced with cat nods. Meanwhile, Ogre Landlord carried on as usual. He strolled through the compound in his spotless white attire, smiling and handing out money to the children, patting their heads as if nothing had happened. It made my skin crawl. Samson, Precious whispered that afternoon as we sat on the steps outside my flat, watching him. Do you notice something strange about the children? What do you mean? I asked. They're quieter, she said, frowning. It's not just Mommy Sandra's Cynthia or Mommy Precious's Victoria. Have you noticed how the children in the compound hardly laugh or play anymore? They used to run around here, making noise all the time. I nodded. She was right. The once lively compound now seemed haunted, especially when it came to the children. Many of them seemed withdrawn, their smiles forced, their laughter hollow. They're scared, Precious said, her voice breaking. They're scared of him. That night, we made a decision. We couldn't wait any longer. We would confront Mommy Sandra, tell her what we had discovered in Ogre Landlord's private room. We needed her on our side. It wasn't easy convincing her. Like many others, Mama Chioma was torn between fear and disbelief. She had seen the bruises on her daughter and heard her cry at night, but the idea that Ogre Landlord, the generous, beloved figure in the community, could be responsible for such evil was hard to accept. What if you're wrong? She asked, her voice trembling. What if he's just misunderstood? I exchanged a glance with precision, and she nodded. It was time to show her the notebook. We retrieved the notebook we had hidden and handed it to her. At first, she was hesitant to open it, but when she did, her face turned pale. She flipped through the pages, her hand covering her mouth as she read the detailed accounts of Ogre Landlord's rituals. This can't be real, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. It is, Precious said softly. We've seen it with our own eyes. The next morning, Mommy Sandra called a meeting with a few trusted tenants. She couldn't keep what she had learned to herself. Slowly, more parents began to come forward with stories about their children, gifts they couldn't explain, strange bruises, sudden illnesses, and their children's refusal to talk about their interactions with Ogre Landlord. Kofi the father of a 7-year-old girl, shared how his daughter had once come home with a doll and sweets but refused to say where she got them. When he pressed her, she cried and said, Uncle Peter said I must not tell. Another parent, Mama Nkechi, broke down as she described how her 9-year-old daughter had stopped playing with her friends and began wetting the bed. I thought she was just going through a phase, she sobbed. But now I see it was more than that. It became clear that Ogre Landlord had been preying on the children for years, using his wealth and charm to silence them and their parents. The room we had discovered was just the tip of the iceberg. By now, the tension in the compound was unbearable. Some tenants still refused to believe the accusations, calling them lies meant to tarnish Ogre Landlord's good name. But others were starting to see the cracks in his perfect facade. Things came to a head when Mommy Precious confronted him directly. It was a sunny afternoon, and Ogre Landlord was sitting in the courtyard, surrounded by children. He was handing out sweets when Mommy Precious stormed up to him, her voice ringing out like a bell. Leave those children alone, she shouted, her finger pointing at him. We know what you've been doing. The entire compound froze. Tenants peeked out of their windows and doorways, watching as the confrontation unfolded. Ogre Landlord looked up, his smile fading. What are you talking about, Precious? He said calmly, his voice as smooth as ever. You know what I'm talking about, she said, stepping closer. You think we don't know about the room? About the handkerchiefs? About the blood? Gasps rippled through the crowd. Oga Landlord stood up slowly, towering over her. You're making a very serious accusation, he said, his tone colder now. Be careful, precious. Lies like this can destroy lives. So can the truth, she shot back. And we will expose you. That night, chaos erupted in the compound. Oga Landlord had left in a hurry, his white SUV screeching out of the gates. Some tenants began packing their belongings, afraid of what might happen next. Others gathered in small groups, whispering and arguing about what they should do. Precious and I stayed in my flat, keeping a low profile. We knew Oga Landlord wouldn't let this go. He was too powerful, too dangerous. But we also knew we couldn't stop now. The children deserved justice. The atmosphere in the compound was suffocating. Oga Landlord hadn't returned since the confrontation with Mommy Precious, and the tension among the tenants had reached a breaking point. Some people still clung to their faith in him, refusing to believe the man who had showered them with kindness and wealth could harbor such evil. Others, like Mommy Cynthia, Precious, and myself, were determined to see justice served. But the question remained, how could we bring down someone as powerful and respected as Oga Landlord? After much deliberation, Mommy Precious suggested that we gather the parents and children who had experienced Oga Landlord's abuse and present their testimonies to the authorities. The problem was convincing the children to speak out. Many of them were too scared, and the parents feared retaliation from Oga Landlord, who had influential connections throughout the community. It was Cynthia, Mommy Sandra's daughter, who gave us the breakthrough. She had been withdrawn since the incident but finally opened up one evening when Precious sat with her and gently coaxed her to talk. He said it was our secret, Cynthia whispered, her small voice trembling. He said if I tell anyone, something bad will happen to my mommy. Precious held her close, tears streaming down her face. Nothing bad will happen to your mommy, I promise. But we need your help to stop him. One by one, other children began to share their stories. Each account was more horrifying than the last. Amanda, Mommy Sandra's youngest daughter, revealed how Oga Landlord would lure them into his flat with promises of gifts and food. He would then lock the door and do unspeakable things, always cleaning up with his infamous white handkerchiefs. With the testimonies gathered, we decided it was time to take the evidence to the police. Precious, Mommy Sandra, and I went to the local station, carrying the notebook we had found in his private room, along with written statements from the parents and children. At first, the officers were skeptical. Oga Landlord was a well-known figure in the community, and his influence extended even to law enforcement. But when we showed them the notebook, their expressions changed. The detailed descriptions of the rituals, the names of the children, and the chilling accounts were too damning to ignore. We'll investigate, one of the officers assured us. But you need to be careful. A man like this won't go down without a fight. The compound was quiet for 2 days after we reported him. But on the third night, Oga Landlord returned. His SUV rolled into the compound just as the clock struck midnight. I watched from my window as he stepped out, his usual calm demeanor replaced with something darker. His face was a mask of fury. He stormed into the courtyard, shouting for everyone to come out. You think you can destroy me, he roared, his voice echoing off the walls. After everything I've done for this community, this is how you repay me. The tenants gathered, some out of fear, others out of curiosity. Oga Landlord paced back and forth, pointing fingers at anyone who dared meet his gaze. You listen to lies. To jealous people who want to ruin my name. But let me warn you, if you try to cross me, you'll regret it. I felt a chill run down my spine. His words weren't just threats, they were promises. Some parents wanted to talk back at him, but he ordered his boys to shut down anybody that talks back at him. The fear of the guns and anger made everyone flew away in a second. The next morning, the police arrived. 2 patrol vans pulled into the compound, and a team of officers marched to Oga Landlord's flat. He tried to put on his usual charm, smiling and shaking hands as if nothing was wrong. "Officers, what is the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with menace. "We have a warrant to search your property," the lead officer said, holding up a document. "Please step aside." Oga Landlord's smile faltered, but he stepped back, allowing them to enter. The tenants watched anxiously as the officers disappeared into his flat. Minutes turned into hours, and when they finally emerged, they were carrying the iron pot, jars from the shelves, and the bloodied handkerchiefs. Gasps filled the air as the items were loaded into the vans. Oga Landlord's calm facade crumbled. He lunged at the officers, shouting, "This is a setup. Lies. All lies." The officers restrained him and placed him in handcuffs. As they led him away, he turned to the tenants, his eyes wild. "You'll regret this. All of you." The news of Oga Landlord's arrest spread like wildfire. The entire community was shaken. Some people still refused to believe the accusations, insisting he had been framed. But as the evidence mounted, the truth became undeniable. The trial was long and grueling. Parents and children testified, recounting their horrifying experiences. The notebook and the items found in his private room were presented as evidence, painting a chilling picture of his decades-long abuse and rituals. It was revealed that the blood he collected from the children was used in rituals to maintain his wealth and power. The sacrifices ensured his continued success, but at the cost of the children's innocence and, in some cases, their health. The final blow came when one of his former associates testified against him, revealing that Oga Landlord had been warned never to have children of his own because the same fate would befall them. This was why he had never married or had children, instead preying on those of others. In the end, the court found him guilty on multiple counts, including sexual abuse, child endangerment, and ritual practices. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison. The compound was never the same after Oga Landlord's downfall. Many tenants moved out, unable to bear the memories of what had happened. Those who stayed worked to rebuild a sense of normalcy, but the scars remained. As for me, I eventually left too. The compound that had once felt like home now felt haunted by the shadows of Oga Landlord's secrets. But I carried with me an important lesson: evil often hides behind the brightest smiles, and sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones we should fear. Years later, I heard that Oga Landlord had died in prison. Some people in the community still spoke of him as a misunderstood man, but for those of us who had lived through the nightmare, there was no doubt about who he really was. He was a monster in white.